I must say, it's wonderful to be in a church where people are clamouring to come forward to proclaim the gospel. That's great good news in itself. However, at Incarnation today, our focus will be on what we as individuals can do to bring hope. Hope to so many people throughout the world who are living in situations where their voices are being suppressed, their lives being threatened, and prisons are being used for brutal torture without any recourse to justice. As victims of injustice, they live in the equivalent of a world full of darkness, longing for someone, anyone, to shine a ray of hope into their lives. Hope that someone somewhere lets them know that they are aware of and care about their plight. Hope that someone somewhere will consider advocating for them, so that over time their hope may grow, and that one day justice, freedom, and perhaps even joy will also be theirs. It is the prophet Micah who raises the question in the Bible by asking us, what does the Lord require of you? By doing so, he is referring to each and every one of us. And he goes on to explain that it is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And I say to you right now, that if indeed you feel that God is calling you to take a stand and to advocate for justice, then you should heed that call and respond in such a way that is pleasing to God. However, in a world often torn apart by greed, intolerance, hatred and wars, some, yes, that have even emerged out of religious conflict, it became apparent that the struggle to gain universal recognition of the sanctity of human life and liberty needed to transcend any one particular religious teaching. This led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948. There are 30 articles included in the document, ranging from the right to equality, freedom from discrimination, and right to life, liberty, and personal security, all the way through to freedom of belief and religion, and the right of peaceful assembly, all designed to enshrine human rights within international law. All things that we see being trampled all around the world right now. In today's gospel reading from Matthew, we read about someone who might have benefited from this declaration of human rights if it had been around at the time. From all accounts, John the Baptist did walk humbly with God. He didn't seek wealth, but wore clothing made of camel's hair and ate a diet of locusts and wild honey. It seems that his only purpose in life was to prepare the way for the ministry of Jesus, the one whose sandals he didn't even feel worthy to carry. Today we heard Jesus telling the crowds that as a prophet, no one had arisen greater than John the Baptist. Yet, because of his incredible humility, the least in the kingdom of heaven was still greater than he. So how did such a humble and good man become a victim of injustice and end up in prison? Well, like many prisoners of conscience that we hear about today, he had spoken out against a crime committed by the political leader of the day, Herod Antipas. Herod had taken a fancy to his half-brother Philip's wife, Herodias, and so he divorced his own wife and married Herodias after getting her to divorce Philip. In accordance with the law, John had rightly accused Herod of committing incest with his sister-in-law, so Herod had unjustly had him arrested. It's believed he was imprisoned in one of Herod's mountain fortresses for at least a year, and if it was anything like the pit that Jesus was imprisoned in on the night of his arrest, it was more than likely deeply underground and pitch black. Yet whether he was living in a literal or a virtual darkness, John would have been desperate to find a glimmer of hope shining into his darkness. Fortunately, John still had disciples of his own, people on the outside who hadn't forgotten him and still cared about him. He was able to send a message to ask if Jesus truly was the Messiah. Jesus answered, "Go tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." Just imagine the joy and hope of salvation this must have brought to John, even though he may have suspected that his earthly life would soon come to an end. For he now knew for sure that more awaited him after his death. For Jesus truly is, the Messiah. John's story reminds me of my time serving the inmates as a volunteer chaplain at Maplehurst Correctional Centre. It's a miserable existence, living each day behind bars. And unfortunately, I wasn't there to try and bust them out of their physical internment. However, the fact that they knew I cared enough to want to visit them, to hear their story, to hold their hand, to read to them, to hear their confession, and to pray for them, whether they were Christian believers or not, and many were not. It helped keep the hope of better days that lay ahead burning in the darkness of their lives. I think that at times most of us look around at the world that we live in today and wonder, what can we do? What can we do to make the lives of others better? Whether it be people here in Canada still suffering from the effects of colonial oppression, racism, or other forms of discrimination, or whether it be people living under brutal political dictatorships, apartheid, violent hostility, and the threat of arrest, torture, and summary execution, simply for speaking out against their leaders, just as John the Baptist had done. But unfortunately for many of us, this is also a passing thought. After all, what can one person do to change the world? The answer to that question is as plain as the words in your service bulletin this morning. When one person, and that is Mary, despite the frightening and overwhelming task set before her, accepted the role of becoming what's known as the Theotokos, which means the one chosen to be the God-bearer. She was to deliver Jesus into the world in human form. Indeed, most significant changes for the better in this world, especially in the area of human rights and social justice, are the result of one person, one person's actions, somebody willing to stand up and say, yes, I hear that call. A few weeks ago, I talked about the actions of one man, Ron Sider, who in 1984 chose to stand up and issue a challenge to attendees at the Mennonite World Conference in Strasbourg, France. Don't claim to be followers of Jesus Christ, he said, unless you are prepared to pick up your own cross and walk in his footsteps. One man's challenge led to Christian peacemaker teams being established throughout the world. Teams who now stand up for justice and human rights in places like Palestine, Iraqi Kurdistan, Haiti, Colombia, and yes, even here, standing up for the rights of First Nations people on Turtle Island. The list of individuals who have stepped up and shown that one person can make a difference is virtually endless. Just think about Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Greta Thunberg, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, and Rosa Parks, whose names all spring to mind, but one name you might not be familiar with is Peter Benenson. Peter was born in 1921 into a Jewish family in London, England. At the tender age of just 16, he helped to establish a relief fund with other schoolboys to support children who'd been orphaned by the Spanish Civil War. In 1946, Benenson began practicing as a lawyer, and in 1957, he was one of a group of British lawyers who founded a UK-based human rights organisation called Justice. However, in 1958, he fell ill, moved to Italy to convalesce, and it was there in the same year that he converted from Judaism to the Roman Catholic Church. Later, when back home in London, he was sitting on a London Underground train, reading an article in a newspaper about Portugal, which at the time was ruled by the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. Any anti-regime conspiracies were deemed to be anti-Portuguese. They were vigorously oppressed by the Portuguese state police and led to instant arrest. Benenson read about 2 young Portuguese students who had been sentenced each to 7 years in prison, simply for having drunk a toast to liberty. He realized that this was his call to action. And so in May 1961, he wrote an article to the editor of the Observer newspaper in London. He called his article "The Forgotten Prisoners." And it was published, and in the article he asked readers to write letters showing support for all those who had been imprisoned for their political or religious beliefs. His article was reprinted in newspapers throughout the world. Just 2 months later, in July 1961, Amnesty International had been founded to coordinate letter-writing campaigns in more than a dozen countries. Amnesty International is now a global movement of over 7 million individuals in more than 150 countries who work collectively to protect and promote human rights. They function independently of any government, political ideology, economic interest, or particular religious belief. By doing so, they remain impartial, and their goal is to ensure that human rights are respected for everyone, everywhere. In 2002, Amnesty International successfully campaigned for the creation of the International Criminal Court, which is the world's first permanent international body capable of bringing perpetrators of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes to justice. However, one of their most effective ground root activities remains their letter writing. And today, on International Human Rights Day, you are each being asked to stay for a few minutes following this service and to take a stand. You are being asked to write a letter as part of Amnesty International's annual Right for Rights campaign. Susan Curran has set up tables over there providing information about the cases we will be advocating for today, and you can either write a card to a prisoner or a letter to a government. It will take no more than 30 minutes. But as an individual, you will be doing something, just as Peter Benenson did. Something that can shine the light of hope into the darkness of someone else's desperate world.